I just kept it to myself. I tried so hard to get through.
Wendi Richter just dropped a bombshell, and it's been a long time coming.
They said they wanted to do a documentary for Hulk Hogan. I said, oh, okay.
For years, the whispers about Hulk Hogan stayed in the shadows. Backstage politics, buried pushes, a legacy built on more than just leg drops and charisma. But now, one of wrestling's original icons has finally stepped forward to say what so many others were afraid to. And she didn't hold back. In a quiet but devastating interview that's already making waves across the wrestling world, Wendi Richter broke her silence about what really went down in the early days of Hulkamania.
You're not going to interview Hulk Hogan? So it was about his...
And what she exposed wasn't just a moment of betrayal. It was a pattern, a blueprint of how Hogan protected himself at the expense of everyone else. And for the first time, we're seeing that blueprint through the eyes of someone who was there before the fame, before the pay-per-views, before the myth became untouchable. This is the story of Wendi Richter's reckoning with Hulk Hogan, and why her words are finally giving voice to the decades of resentment that so many wrestlers being compared. And this time, it's not coming from an angry veteran looking for attention or a bitter grudge. This is coming from someone who was there, who lived through the era when Hulk Hogan was at the top of the world and saw firsthand what really went on behind the curtain. Wendi Richter isn't just another name from the 80s. She was the 80s, the face of the women's revolution long before the company ever tried to coin that phrase. And now, nearly 4 decades later, she's telling the truth about Hulk Hogan, about what he really did to his peers, and why so many WWE superstars still can't forgive him. For years, Hogan's been marketed as the American hero, the bandana-wearing, muscle-bound symbol of 80s glory, telling kids to say their prayers and take their vitamins. But according to Richter, and many others who finally begun to speak up, the man behind the sunglasses was a whole different story. She's not the only one saying it, but she may be the one with the clearest view. Wendi's words are sharp, not because she's angry, but because she remembers. She remembers what happened to her. She remembers what she saw happen to others. And for the first time in years, she's naming names. It all started with what should have been a golden age. In the mid-1980s, wrestling was exploding. MTV, WrestleMania, music crossovers, it was a spectacle. And at the heart of that boom were 2 faces, Hulk Hogan for the men and Wendi Richter for the women. The two were constantly marketed side by side, Hogan flexing in his yellow trunks, Richter posing with pop icon Cyndi Lauper. They were both on cereal boxes, both on Saturday morning cartoons, and both being sold to America as the future of professional wrestling. But behind the scenes, the relationship wasn't as perfect as it looked. According to Richter, Hogan wasn't a teammate. He wasn't even a friend. He was a businessman. Cold, calculated, and always working angles to make sure only his star shined. While Wendi was pushing boundaries for women's wrestling and putting in the work to elevate the division, Hogan was allegedly doing everything he could to stay the center of attention, even if that meant stepping on those who helped build the company's popularity. She recalled one moment in particular, during the original rock and wrestling era, when she was supposed to share the spotlight with Hogan on a promotional tour. Everything was set, she said. It was supposed to be both of us, equal billing. But suddenly, my name vanished from the ads. No one told me why. No one explained anything. And then I find out later, it was Hogan who didn't want to split the spotlight. It wouldn't be the first or last time that kind of thing happened. Backstage, Richter began to hear more and more stories. Quiet at first, whispers. Other wrestlers, male and female, talking about how Hogan would insert himself into booking meetings, pitch changes to scripts that always made him look stronger, and casually dismiss anyone who might become too popular. It was a pattern, and the more you heard it, the harder it became to ignore. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1985, just months after headlining the first ever WrestleMania and helping to launch the WWE into mainstream success, Wendi Richter was suddenly betrayed. She was scheduled to defend her women's championship against a masked wrestler named the Spider Lady. It was supposed to be a routine match. But midway through the bout, the Spider Lady botched a move and forcibly pinned Richter for a 3 count, even though she clearly kicked out. It wasn't a mistake. It was a setup. a premeditated screw job orchestrated without Richter's knowledge. The woman under the mask? It was none other than the fabulous Moolah, and the entire incident had been organized by Vince McMahon, who was reportedly furious at Richter's refusal to sign a new contract. But what went unspoken at the time, and what Richter now suggests, was that Hogan knew all about it. Not only did he know, Richter claims, but he supported it. Why? Because she was becoming too popular. In the months before the screw job, Wendi had begun drawing massive crowds. Fans were showing up in droves to see her perform. Magazines featured her on covers, merchandising numbers were spiking. And according to insiders, some executives feared she might start overshadowing Hogan's appeal, especially among younger fans and families. In Richter's words, "I was on fire, and that didn't sit well with people who thought they were the stars." She never worked for WWE again after that night. Hogan, for his part, never spoke publicly about the incident, never defended Richter, never questioned the treatment of one of the company's top stars. For someone who claimed to stand for loyalty, brotherhood, and fairness, his silence was deafening. And Richter isn't alone. As the years went on, more and more wrestlers began telling their own stories. Stories that, when pieced together, reveal a consistent and deeply troubling pattern. Hogan wasn't just difficult to work with. He was reportedly manipulative, political, and actively hostile to anyone he saw as a threat to his legacy. Take the infamous SummerSlam 2005 incident where Shawn Michaels agreed to face Hogan in what was supposed to be a two-match program. Hogan would win one, Michaels would win the other. Simple. But after Hogan got his win in the first match, he suddenly pulled out of the rematch. Michaels was furious. He oversold every move in that match, turning it into a farce, mocking Hogan in the process. Many insiders saw it as a not-so-subtle protest, or the 2006 feud with Randy Orton. The company wanted to give Orton the win, to solidify his legend killer gimmick and push him to the next level. But Hogan allegedly refused to lose, and just like that, Orton's momentum was stalled. Again. Time and time again, it was the same story. And then came the real scandal, the one that made headlines around the world. In 2015, leaked audio revealed Hulk Hogan using racist language during a private conversation. The comments were disturbing. The backlash was immediate. WWE terminated its relationship with Hogan, removed him from the Hall of Fame, and effectively erased him from its history, at least temporarily. To this day, the scandal remains one of the most damaging in WWE history. Wendi Richter, watching it all unfold, wasn't surprised. To her, it was just another piece of a puzzle she'd already seen too clearly. In interviews years later, she said what many in the industry were afraid to say publicly, that the real Hulk Hogan was not the hero he portrayed on TV. He was a symbol, yes, but a symbol of a system that pushed people down while lifting up only those willing to play the game. A system that rewarded betrayal, manipulation, and politics over talent, hard work, and loyalty. Wendi didn't play that game, and she paid the price, but now, in the twilight of her career, she's reclaiming her voice. She's no longer afraid to say what others only whisper. And as she tells her story alongside those of so many others, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The legend of Hulk Hogan may have ruled the ring for decades, but the truth about the man behind the myth? That story is only now being written. But Wendi Richter wasn't the only one whose career had collided with Hogan's political machinery. Her story was just the opening thread in a much larger web of broken promises, missed opportunities, and buried resentment that spanned decades. Because once you start pulling at that thread, you start to realize something chilling. Every time a new generation tried to rise, there was always one man standing in their way. And his mustache wasn't the only thing stuck in the past. Let's rewind to Shawn Michaels. In 2005, when Michaels was already a Hall of Fame caliber performer, WWE saw an opportunity to build a dream match, Mr. WrestleMania versus the immortal Hulk Hogan. It had all the ingredients of a blockbuster: nostalgia, charisma, and a chance to finally settle who really carried WWE through its biggest decades. But what happened next wasn't a celebration. It was a mockery. Because when it came time to decide who would win, Hogan once again refused to lose. The plan was simple. Hogan wins the first match at SummerSlam, and then Michaels gets his win back in a rematch. But that second match never happened. Hogan backed out, leaving Shawn hanging in the wind. And how did Michaels react? On live television, he oversold every move Hogan hit him with, cartoonishly flopping around the ring, turning a main event into a comedy skit. It was bitter, it was calculated, and it was the only power Michaels had left, to expose how ridiculous Hogan's ego had become. But Hogan didn't care, because he never did. You see, Wendi wasn't just talking about one betrayal. She was pointing at a pattern, a culture that Hogan didn't just exist within, he created it. A culture where loyalty was currency, and if you weren't useful to Hogan's image, you were expendable, even if you were a friend, even if you were family. Even Macho Man Randy Savage. Few names were as tied to Hulkamania as Savage. Their team-ups, their rivalries, their WrestleMania moments, they defined an era. But once the cameras stopped rolling, things were different. Savage was pushed aside, his star dimmed, and rumors of Hogan manipulating his decline were everywhere. To this day, fans debate what really happened. But one thing is clear, Savage never forgave him. Even in his final interviews, there was a tension in his voice when Hogan's name came up. A cold distance, like a man who knew he'd been burned and chose never to trust that fire again. And then came 2015, the final nail. The racial slur scandal didn't just damage Hogan's reputation, it shattered it. The locker room, especially its black superstars, couldn't ignore what he'd said. This wasn't an accident, it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a window into the real man behind the sunglasses. And what they saw, they couldn't unsee. Mark Henry, one of the most respected voices in the industry, spoke for many when he said he wasn't angry because Hogan used a word. He was angry because he showed his true self. The fake apologies, the attempts at damage control, the lack of real remorse. Henry didn't want a soundbite apology, he wanted change, he wanted accountability. But Hogan had never learned to take the blame. Not in 1985, not in 1993, and not now. New Day refused to be seen with him. Titus O'Neil avoided his segments. Even Booker T, who once praised Hogan, later admitted that the wounds hadn't healed. And what about Wendi? She watched it all unfold from a distance. She didn't need to say, "I told you so." The system that once chewed her up was now devouring itself. Because you can only run the same game for so long. Eventually, people catch on. And when they do, it all comes crashing down. By 2020, Hogan had become a ghost in the business he helped build. His appearances were limited, his reception lukewarm. The younger generation didn't chant his name, they whispered about his scandals, his betrayals, his legacy, not as a hero, but as a warning. And still, he didn't get it. In interviews, he'd deflect. Talk about growing up rough, blame the media, talk about loyalty and brotherhood, as if the very people he betrayed were just too sensitive to handle the real world of wrestling. He didn't understand that it wasn't about words anymore. It was about trust, about respect, about all the careers he stepped on to protect his own. When Wendi Richter sat down to speak, she didn't rant, she didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just told the truth. Clearly, calmly, and with decades of quiet pain behind every word. Because she had lived it. The promises, the handshake deals, the long flights home with no answers and no belt. She had seen what Hogan's fame could do, not just to her, but to the whole business. And she wasn't the only one anymore. So when fans today ask, why do so many wrestlers hate Hulk Hogan? They need only look at the silence, the skipped tributes, the missing tweets, the names that should have been at his side during his final years but weren't. Wendi Richter didn't burn the bridge. She just held up a flashlight and showed everyone what was already smoldering. And that's the real legacy of Hulk Hogan. Not just the promos, the t-shirts, or the WrestleManias, but the trail of broken relationships and buried trust left in his wake. The story Wendi Richter shared isn't about bitterness, it's about clarity. Because when enough people tell the same story, from Randy Orton to Bret Hart, from Shawn Michaels to Booker T, it's no longer a coincidence. It's a pattern. A legacy built not just on championships and catchphrases, but on silence, manipulation, and self-preservation. Wendi didn't come forward to rewrite history. She came forward because the record had already been written by everyone but those who paid the price. Hulk Hogan may have been the face of a generation, the icon on the lunchbox, the hero in the main event. But behind the curtain, too many saw something else. Something colder, something calculated. And when legends like Wendi finally speak, not to sensationalize but to set the record straight, they aren't just sharing gossip. They're holding up a mirror to an industry that still hasn't fully reconciled with the damage left in his shadow. So the next time the music hits, the bandana goes on, and someone yells, "What you gonna do?" Maybe the real question is, what did he already do? And who's still paying for it?